They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But what they don't tell you is how painfully slow time becomes when your heart is breaking, and you're pretending everything is fine. My story didn't begin with shouting or slammed doors. It began with a quiet realization that something essential had slipped away from my life while I wasn't looking. I used to believe that memories were safe, that once something beautiful happened, it stayed beautiful forever, preserved like photographs in an album. But I learned the hard way that memories can rot when left untouched, when they're stuffed into boxes and pushed to the back of closets, or buried deep inside hard drives and forgotten folders of the mind. My heartbreak wasn't dramatic enough for people to notice. It came wrapped in polite conversations, forced smiles, and the slow erosion of respect. I was still living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, sitting at the same table, yet I felt like a guest in my own life. There's a unique kind of pain in realizing that the person who once made you feel chosen now treats you like an afterthought. I remember the exact moment the shift became undeniable, not because something terrible happened all at once, but because nothing happened at all. I spoke and my words landed nowhere. I asked and my questions were met with silence or distraction. I existed, but I was no longer seen. For a long time I blamed myself. I wondered if I had become boring, invisible, or simply too easy to ignore. Society has a way of teaching us that endurance is love, that staying quiet is strength, and that asking for more makes you demanding. So I endured. I stayed quiet. I convinced myself that loyalty meant shrinking. But while I was busy holding everything together, something inside me was quietly unraveling. Nights became longer, filled with thoughts I couldn't silence. Memories replaying with a cruel clarity I had avoided during the day. I would lie awake wondering how someone could slowly detach from a shared life without ever announcing their departure. There was no official ending, no clear betrayal I could point to, just a growing emptiness that followed me from room to room. Friends would ask how things were going, and I would answer automatically, fine, because explaining the truth felt too exhausting. How do you explain grief for something that hasn't technically ended but already feels dead? Over time, I began to notice patterns I had ignored before. The way conversations stopped including me, the way decisions were made without my input, the way my presence became optional. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. Anger burns hot and fast, but this was a slow, dull ache that settled into my bones. Still, I didn't explode. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't even confront anyone. Instead, I observed. I listened. I paid attention. And in that quiet awareness, something unexpected began to take shape. I started to see my situation clearly, stripped of excuses and illusions. I realized that waiting for acknowledgement from someone who no longer valued me was a form of self-abandonment. That truth was painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time in a long while, I asked myself a question that had nothing to do with pleasing others. What would it look like if I chose myself? That question didn't bring instant answers, but it planted a seed. And seeds don't announce themselves when they're planted. They grow silently underground, gathering strength where no one can see. On the surface, nothing changed. I still smiled when expected, still fulfilled responsibilities, still played my role convincingly. But internally, a shift had begun. I wasn't plotting revenge in the way people imagine. There were no dramatic schemes or grand confrontations. What I was doing was far more dangerous to the version of life that had hurt me. I was reclaiming my sense of worth. I was preparing not to destroy someone else but to rebuild myself. And I had no idea yet how powerful that quiet decision would become, or how everything I thought I had lost was about to transform into something I never expected. Time has a strange way of revealing truths when you stop forcing yourself to look away. Once I allowed myself to see my life as it really was, not as I wished it to be, everything felt heavier and clearer at the same time. I began to notice how much of myself I had slowly given up without realizing it. My opinions had softened into agreement. My dreams had shrunk into practical plans, and my voice had learned when to stay quiet. None of it happened overnight. It was a gradual erosion like water wearing down stone, so slow that you don't notice the damage until the shape is completely changed. I started replaying moments from the past, not with nostalgia, but with honesty. Conversations where my concerns were dismissed as overreactions. Decisions made about our future where my input was treated as optional. Jokes at my expense that everyone laughed at while I smiled along, pretending they didn't sting. What hurt the most wasn't the loss itself, but the realization that I had been slowly training myself to accept less, convincing myself that compromise meant love. Somewhere along the way, I confused patience with self-neglect. I told myself that all relationships required sacrifice, that loyalty meant enduring discomfort, that speaking up would only create conflict. So I swallowed my feelings until they became familiar, until loneliness felt normal even when I wasn't alone. The house was often quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that hums with unspoken tension, where every sound feels louder because no one is really listening. I would move through my days on autopilot, completing tasks efficiently while my mind drifted elsewhere, wondering when I had stopped feeling like a partner and started feeling like background noise. At night, the questions became sharper. Was this really the life I had chosen? Or was it the life I had settled for? Had I mistaken stability for happiness? Those questions were uncomfortable, but they refused to leave me alone. I began to understand that ignoring them was no longer an option. Something inside me was waking up, and it wasn't angry, it was tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of minimizing myself to make others comfortable. Tired of waiting for appreciation that never came. That exhaustion, surprisingly, became my strength. When you're exhausted in the right way, you stop caring about appearances and start caring about truth. I didn't announce this shift to anyone. There were no dramatic speeches or confrontations. I simply started paying attention to myself again. I noticed how my body reacted to certain conversations, how my chest tightened when I felt dismissed, how my shoulders relaxed when I imagined a life that didn't require constant justification. I began carving out small moments of solitude, not to escape but to think. Long walks where I let my thoughts wander freely. Quiet mornings where I drank my coffee slowly, asking myself what I actually wanted instead of what was expected of me. Those moments felt almost rebellious. The more space I gave myself, the clearer things became. I realized that the love I had been fighting to preserve no longer existed in the form I remembered. What remained was habit, obligation, and fear of change. That realization was devastating, but it was also honest. And honesty, once it enters your life, refuses to be ignored. I started to imagine a future that didn't revolve around fixing someone else's indifference. A future where my worth wasn't measured by how much I tolerated. It scared me because change always does, but it also filled me with a quiet sense of possibility. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't fantasizing about dramatic justice. What I was doing was far more transformative. I was slowly detaching my identity from a role that had been draining me. I was learning to stand emotionally on my own feet again. And although no one around me noticed the shift, it was happening all the same. Like ice cracking beneath the surface of a frozen lake. Something was moving, something irreversible. I didn't yet know where this awakening would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A sense that my life still belonged to me. Once awareness settles in, it changes the way you move through the world. I began to see my surroundings differently, as if a thin veil had been lifted from my eyes. The same rooms that once felt familiar now felt strangely confining, filled with echoes of conversations where my needs were postponed or ignored. I noticed how often I adjusted my behavior to maintain peace, how carefully I chose my words, how instinctively I avoided topics that might inconvenience someone else. It wasn't that I was afraid of conflict, it was that I had been taught over time that my discomfort mattered less. That realization stung more than any argument ever could. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions about the past, not to assign blame, but to understand my own patterns. Why had I stayed silent for so long? Why did I equate being needed with being valued? Why did I believe that endurance was proof of love? These questions followed me everywhere, during errands, while washing dishes, even in moments of forced laughter during social gatherings. People saw me as composed, reliable, the one who always had everything under control. What they didn't see was the constant negotiation happening inside me, the internal debate between who I had been and who I was becoming. Slowly, I began to shift small behaviors that no one else noticed. I stopped immediately agreeing to things that drained me. I allowed pauses in conversations instead of rushing to fill the silence. I began saying no without long explanations. Each small act felt both terrifying and empowering, like testing a muscle that hadn't been used in years. The more I practiced, the more I realized how much energy I had been wasting trying to be agreeable. I wasn't difficult, I was simply human. This shift wasn't welcomed by everyone. I sensed subtle resistance, the slight change in tone when I asserted myself, the confusion when I didn't respond the way I used to. It confirmed something important. The version of me that was easiest to live with had been the one that asked for the least. Accepting that truth was painful, but it also clarified everything. I wasn't losing myself. I was reclaiming parts that had been buried. Alongside this emotional awakening came a strange sense of grief. Not just for the relationship I was in, but for the version of myself I had abandoned to keep it intact. I mourned the dreams I had postponed, the curiosity I had quieted, the confidence I had slowly surrendered. But grief, when allowed, has a way of making room for growth. Instead of pushing it away, I sat with it. I let myself feel the sadness without turning it into self-blame. And in doing so, I discovered something unexpected: compassion for myself. I stopped viewing my past silence as weakness and started seeing it as survival. I had done the best I could with the understanding I had at the time. That realization softened the anger I thought I needed to move forward. I wasn't interested in punishment anymore. I was interested in freedom. As this internal shift deepened, I became more observant, more aware of the dynamics around me. I noticed how control doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes it's subtle, disguised as concern or practicality. I saw how expectations had been quietly placed on me, shaping my choices without ever being openly discussed. Once you recognize those patterns, you can't unsee them. And once you stop participating in them, the balance changes. I didn't announce my transformation. I let it unfold naturally, quietly, like a tide pulling back from shore. Outwardly, life looked the same. Inwardly, everything was different. I no longer felt desperate to be understood by someone who wasn't listening. I no longer measured my worth by someone else's approval. I began imagining possibilities that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. Those thoughts felt radical, almost forbidden, but they also felt right. For the first time in years, my future didn't feel like an extension of someone else's expectations. It felt open, uncertain, and entirely my own. And although I still hadn't taken any visible action, the most important shift had already happened. I had stopped waiting for permission to exist fully. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer willing to disappear to keep the peace. With this new awareness came a shift in how I experienced everyday life. As though I had stepped slightly to the side of it and could finally see the full picture. I became more attuned to the emotional undercurrents in every interaction. The subtle power exchanges that once went unnoticed because I was too busy maintaining harmony. I realized how often I had anticipated other people's needs while neglecting my own. How quickly I apologized for taking up space. How naturally I deferred even when my instincts told me otherwise. These habits weren't flaws. They were learned responses, survival strategies built over years of prioritizing peace over authenticity. But now that I could see them clearly, I could no longer pretend they were harmless. I began experimenting with presence, showing up fully instead of halfway, listening to my own reactions instead of suppressing them. When something felt wrong, I didn't immediately rationalize it away. I allowed discomfort to exist without rushing to smooth it over. That alone changed the dynamic of my relationships. Conversations slowed. Silences stretched longer. And in those silences, truth surfaced. Some people leaned in, curious and respectful. Others pulled away, unsettled by the absence of my usual compliance. Their reactions taught me more than any explanation ever could. I started to understand that being valued for what you provide is not the same as being valued for who you are. For years, my role had been clear. The stabilizer, the fixer, the emotional anchor. Letting go of that role felt like stepping into open water without knowing how deep it was. Fear crept in, whispering familiar warnings about loneliness and regret. But something inside me was steadier now. I trusted myself enough to keep going, even when the path ahead wasn't clearly marked. I also began reconnecting with parts of myself that had been dormant for far too long. Interests I once dismissed as impractical resurfaced. Curiosity returned. I found myself reading, learning, imagining possibilities that extended beyond the narrow confines of my old identity. These weren't grand plans. They were quiet reconnections, small sparks of joy that reminded me I was more than the sum of my sacrifices. At times, guilt tried to intervene, telling me that wanting more was selfish, that changing was a betrayal of commitments I had made long ago. But I reframed that narrative. Growth isn't betrayal, it's honesty. Staying stagnant to preserve an illusion only deepens resentment. I didn't want resentment. I wanted alignment. As this internal transformation continued, I noticed a subtle but powerful shift in how I carried myself. My posture changed. My voice steadied. I no longer rushed to justify my feelings or soften my boundaries. That confidence didn't come from certainty. It came from self-trust. I trusted that I could handle discomfort, that I could survive disapproval, that I didn't need to be liked by everyone to be at peace with myself. This new way of being didn't erase the pain of the past, but it changed my relationship to it. Instead of viewing my experiences as wasted time, I began seeing them as lessons that had shaped my resilience. I stopped asking why things had happened to me and started asking what they were teaching me. That shift was subtle but profound. It transformed my story from one of endurance to one of evolution. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was becoming someone truer. And although the world around me hadn't dramatically changed yet, I felt a growing sense of momentum. Something was building beneath the surface, a readiness for action that no longer felt forced or reactive. I knew that eventually decisions would need to be made, conversations would need to happen, and paths would need to diverge. But for now, I allowed myself to exist in this in-between space, no longer who I was, not yet who I was becoming. It was uncomfortable, uncertain, and strangely empowering. I wasn't chasing revenge or validation. I was cultivating clarity. And with each passing day, that clarity made one thing unmistakably clear. Whatever came next, I would meet it standing firmly in my own truth, no longer willing to trade my peace for familiarity. At some point, awareness turns into preparation, and preparation quietly reshapes your priorities. I began to sense that I was standing at the edge of a turning point, even if I couldn't yet see what lay beyond it. The more grounded I became within myself, the less energy I spent reacting to what others did or didn't do. Instead of scanning conversations for approval or reassurance, I listened for honesty. I noticed how often truth arrived softly, disguised as discomfort, and how easily it had been drowned out in the past by my desire to keep things stable. Stability, I realized, had come at a cost. It had demanded that I remain predictable, accommodating, and emotionally available without expecting the same in return. Recognizing that pattern didn't make me bitter. It made me decisive. I began organizing my life in subtle but meaningful ways, creating mental and emotional space where there had once been clutter. I reflected deeply on what I wanted my future to feel like, not just what it should look like. Peace, autonomy, curiosity. These became guiding words, replacing outdated goals centered around endurance and obligation. I paid closer attention to my instincts, trusting them as valid signals rather than inconveniences to be ignored. When something felt off, I didn't dismiss it. When something felt right, I allowed myself to lean into it without guilt. This shift affected my relationships more than I expected. Some connections grew stronger, built on mutual respect and authenticity. Others weakened, revealing how much they had relied on my silence to function smoothly. Letting those dynamics change was painful, but it was also necessary. I understood that growth often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. There were moments when doubt resurfaced, whispering that it might be easier to return to what was familiar, even if it was limiting. But each time that thought appeared, I reminded myself why I had started this journey. I had grown tired of shrinking my world to fit someone else's comfort. I wanted a life that expanded me, not one that required constant negotiation of my worth. As my inner resolve strengthened, I began making practical decisions that reflected my emotional clarity. I explored opportunities one had once dismissed as unrealistic. I reconnected with interests that had been sidelined in the name of responsibility. These weren't impulsive choices, they were intentional steps toward alignment. I also learned to sit with uncertainty without trying to control it. For years, I had equated certainty with safety, believing that knowing what came next was essential to feeling secure. But certainty, I realized, can be an illusion. True safety comes from trusting yourself to adapt, to learn, to rebuild if necessary. That realization freed me from the paralysis of overthinking. I stopped waiting for the perfect moment or the right conditions. I understood that waiting had become another form of avoidance. Action didn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. Sometimes the most powerful changes happen quietly, through consistent, intentional choices made day after day. As I continued this process, I felt a growing sense of ownership over my own life. My story no longer felt like something that was happening to me. It felt like something I was actively shaping. That shift changed everything. Even when fear appeared, it no longer dictated my decisions. Fear became a signal, not a stop sign. I listened to it, acknowledged it, and moved forward anyway. The idea of revenge no longer held any appeal. I wasn't interested in proving anyone wrong or seeking validation through success. What I wanted was peace that couldn't be taken away, fulfillment that didn't depend on someone else's approval. And for the first time, that vision felt achievable. I knew challenges still lay ahead, that clarity would eventually demand action, and that difficult conversations were inevitable. But instead of dreading them, I felt ready. Whatever came next, I would face it with honesty and self-respect. I wasn't returning to who I used to be. I was stepping into a version of myself that had been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. And with each deliberate choice, I moved closer to a life defined not by endurance, but by intention. There comes a moment when inner clarity demands outward movement, when staying still begins to feel more dangerous than taking a step forward. For me, that moment arrived quietly, without fanfare, on an ordinary day that felt anything but ordinary inside. I realized I could no longer live in preparation mode, endlessly reflecting and refining my thoughts while postponing action. The life I was imagining required participation, not just intention. That understanding didn't rush me into impulsive decisions. Instead, it grounded me. I began approaching my circumstances with a calm determination that surprised even me. Rather than reacting emotionally, I responded thoughtfully, weighing choices not by how comfortable they were, but by how aligned they felt with who I had become. I noticed how my sense of self had stabilized. Where I once second-guessed myself endlessly, I now trusted my judgment enough to move forward even without complete certainty. That trust was new, and it felt fragile at first, but each decision reinforced it. I stopped over-explaining myself. I stopped seeking reassurance for choices that felt right. I allowed others to have their reactions without absorbing them as verdicts on my worth. This shift altered the emotional landscape around me. Conversations became more honest, sometimes more tense, but always more real. I didn't shy away from discomfort anymore. I understood that discomfort was often a sign of growth, not danger. As I began setting clearer boundaries, I noticed how much energy I regained. Energy that had once been spent managing expectations, smoothing conflicts, and minimizing my needs was now available for creativity, curiosity, and focus. I used that energy to explore paths that once felt inaccessible. I took steps toward independence that were both practical and symbolic, each one reinforcing the message that I was capable of directing my own life. There were moments of fear, of course. Change has a way of stirring old insecurities, reminding you of every risk involved. But fear no longer paralyzed me. It accompanied me, acknowledged but no longer in control. I reminded myself that I had already survived the most painful part, realizing I was living a life that no longer fit. Everything beyond that was movement, not loss. I also became more selective about where I invested my emotional energy. I learned that not every opinion deserved my attention, and not every relationship warranted unlimited access to my inner world. That discernment brought peace. I didn't feel hardened or distant. I felt protected. With each passing day, my sense of agency grew stronger. I began to see my future not as a continuation of the past, but as a space of possibility shaped by my values. I reflected on the idea of revenge, the dramatic satisfaction people imagine when wronged, and realized how little it resonated with me now. Revenge keeps you tethered to the harm, anchored to the very thing you're trying to escape. What I wanted was release. I wanted a life that didn't revolve around proving anything to anyone. That desire guided my choices more than anger ever could. As I moved forward, I noticed how my perspective had shifted from survival to creation. I wasn't just avoiding pain anymore. I was building something meaningful. That shift transformed how I approached obstacles. Challenges became information rather than confirmation of failure. Setbacks became adjustments, not endpoints. I allowed myself to be a beginner again, to learn without judgment, to grow without a predetermined timeline. That humility was freeing. It reminded me that life doesn't have to be figured out all at once to be lived fully. As the distance between who I was and who I was becoming widened, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey itself. Even the painful chapters had given me insight, resilience, and clarity I wouldn't trade away. I understood now that my transformation wasn't about erasing the past. It was about integrating it wisely. Every experience had led me here, to a place of grounded confidence and quiet strength. And although the path ahead still held unknowns, I no longer feared them. I trusted myself to navigate whatever came next. I had learned how to stand in my own truth without apology, how to choose growth over comfort, and how to move forward without carrying the weight of resentment. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment it truly became mine. As my life continued to shift into something more intentional, I began to notice a subtle but powerful change in how the world responded to me. It wasn't that people suddenly treated me differently because I demanded it. It was because I no longer invited dismissal. Confidence, I learned, doesn't need to announce itself. It quietly reshapes the space around you. I carried myself with a steadiness that came from knowing my limits and honoring them. Where I once hesitated, I now paused with purpose. Where I once filled silence with explanations, I allowed it to exist without fear. That silence often revealed more than words ever could. I also found myself reflecting deeply on the meaning of justice and closure. For a long time, I had assumed closure came from confrontation, from having the right conversation or receiving the right apology. But as days passed, it became clear that closure is something you give yourself. It arrives when you stop waiting for someone else to validate your pain and start validating your growth. I no longer needed answers to every unanswered question. I no longer needed to understand every motive behind what had happened. Understanding myself had become far more important. This shift brought an unexpected sense of peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on circumstances, but a durable peace rooted in self-respect. I began to enjoy my own company again, appreciating the quiet moments that once felt lonely. Solitude became restorative instead of empty. I filled my days with activities that nourished me, not because they impressed anyone, but because they felt meaningful. I noticed how joy returned in small, ordinary ways. A moment of laughter, a sense of accomplishment, a calm evening without emotional tension. These moments reminded me that happiness doesn't always arrive in dramatic breakthroughs. Sometimes it returns gently, almost unnoticed, when you finally make room for it. As my internal world settled, my external life followed suit. I made decisions that reflected my values rather than my fears. I chose clarity over comfort, honesty over avoidance. Some relationships evolved, others naturally fell away. I let that happen without clinging or resentment. Letting go, I discovered, doesn't always mean loss. Often it means making space for something better aligned. I stopped defining myself by what I had endured and started defining myself by how I chose to live now. That distinction mattered. It shifted my narrative from one of survival to one of authorship. I was no longer just reacting to circumstances, I was shaping them. I took pride in my ability to navigate uncertainty with grace, to face challenges without losing my sense of self. Even when doubt surfaced, it no longer controlled my direction. I had learned how to listen to it without obeying it. The idea of revenge, once romanticized as a form of justice, felt increasingly hollow. Revenge seeks to balance a scale that no longer matters once you've moved on. True power, I realized, comes from indifference. Not the cold, dismissive kind, but the peaceful kind that arises when someone no longer has the ability to disturb your inner equilibrium. I wasn't numb, I was free. Free from the constant mental replay of past hurts. Free from the need to prove my worth through endurance or achievement. I allowed myself to celebrate how far I had come, acknowledging the courage it took to change without knowing exactly how things would turn out. That courage became my quiet companion. I carried it with me into each new decision, each unfamiliar situation, each moment of vulnerability. I trusted it to guide me just as I trusted myself. As I looked ahead, the future felt open rather than intimidating. I didn't need it to be perfect, I needed it to be honest. Whatever challenges awaited, I knew I would meet them grounded in the person I had become. I had learned how to choose myself without guilt, how to grow without resentment, and how to let go without fear. My story was no longer defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I had reclaimed. And in that reclamation I found something far more satisfying than revenge. I found peace. In the end, what surprised me most was not how much my life changed, but how natural that change eventually felt. The version of me who once measured her worth by how much she could endure now felt distant, almost like someone I had known in another lifetime. I didn't erase her. I honored her. She survived so that I could live differently. Looking back, I understood that every moment of discomfort, every night of quiet questioning, had been guiding me toward this place of clarity. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no cinematic showdown where everything was suddenly resolved. Instead, there was something far more powerful: acceptance. Acceptance of what had been, acceptance of what would never be, and acceptance of who I had become through it all. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head, stopped imagining alternate outcomes where things might have turned out differently. Those versions of the story no longer mattered. What mattered was the present moment and the sense of ownership I felt over my own life. I noticed how calm had replaced urgency, how confidence had replaced self-doubt. I no longer rushed decisions out of fear of being left behind. I moved at my own pace, trusting that what was meant for me would not require self-betrayal. There was a quiet dignity in that realization. I began to recognize peace not as the absence of problems, but as the absence of internal conflict. I wasn't fighting myself anymore. My thoughts, actions, and values were finally aligned, and that alignment created a sense of stability I had never experienced before. I learned to appreciate the simplicity of that stability. The way mornings felt lighter, the way my body relaxed when I entered my own space, the way my laughter came more easily, unforced and genuine. These weren't grand achievements, but they were victories nonetheless. I understood now that healing doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives softly, in the way you breathe more deeply without realizing why. As time passed, I found myself less interested in telling my story for validation and more interested in living it fully. I didn't need anyone else to acknowledge my growth for it to be real. The proof was in how I felt, how I showed up for myself, how I navigated challenges without losing my center. I became someone who listened to her intuition, who trusted her instincts, who valued her own company. That transformation didn't make me immune to pain or disappointment, but it gave me the tools to face them without losing myself. I had learned that resilience isn't about hardening your heart. It's about keeping it open without letting it be defined by hurt. The idea of revenge, once framed as justice, now felt small compared to the life I was building. I didn't need to see anyone else fall in order to stand tall. My growth spoke for itself. In choosing peace, I chose freedom. Freedom from old narratives, from limiting beliefs, from roles that no longer fit. I allowed myself to imagine a future guided by curiosity rather than fear, by intention rather than obligation. And in that future I saw possibility, not because everything was perfect, but because I trusted myself to handle whatever came next. If there is one truth I carry with me now, it's this: you don't reclaim your power by proving someone wrong. You reclaim it by no longer needing their approval. The coldest revenge isn't bitterness or success measured against someone else. It's living a life so aligned, so grounded, that the past loses its grip on you. I didn't just survive what happened to me. I transformed because of it. And that transformation became the quiet, undeniable proof that my story was never about what was taken from me, but about what I chose to rebuild.